This is my current gaming rig. It features an i7-4790K, GTX 980 and 16GB of DDR3. It's served me well over the past 6 years and I've been able to play most games at 1080p 60fps with decent settings. However, before I upgrade my system, I wanted to see how it fares in 2020. To find out how it performs, I decided to test this system in 20 games at 1080p, aiming for an average of 60fps throughout. I'll be going through each game in some depth to give you an idea of how they run and what you can expect from a similar system. So, first up we have Red Dead Redemption 2. The game ran at 62fps on average during my hour-long gaming session, with a 1% low of 37 frames per second. Setting the game to use ultra textures with a mixture of medium and low settings, I was able to get a good balance of visual fidelity to performance. Bumping textures down to high will see a gain in performance, however I wouldn't recommend using anything but ultra textures as anything below that looks muddy at 1080p. If you can live with a softer look in favour of the extra frames, then go for it, but either way you should get a smoother experience than on consoles. Next up is The Witcher 3. Using the higher preset for both graphics and processing, we got a decent 75fps on average, with a 1% low of 56. The game rarely dropped below 60fps even in the more demanding areas of the game. I was able to play through the entire game and DLCs at a locked 60fps most of the time. This, in my opinion, makes the PC version the best way to experience The Witcher 3. Gears 5 is next with a mix of ultra and high settings. We get 83fps on average with a respectable 1% low of 54. Xbox Game Studios have really upped their game in the past few years when it comes to PC ports, and Gears 5 is no exception. A highly optimised game with stunning visuals running on Unreal Engine 4, Gears 5 runs smoothly with no stutter to be seen, making for a great gameplay experience. A game I've really enjoyed playing through recently is the Outer Worlds. Set to the very high preset, we were able to get a relatively playable experience, with 66fps on average and a 1% low of 37. Built in Unreal Engine 4, but unlike Gears 5, the Outer Worlds is played with a ton of micro-stutter. This is particularly evident when entering more highly populated areas, such as in the town of Edgewater. This is a shame as it otherwise detracts from a great game. However, it isn't all bad news, there are a few things we can do to get a more playable experience. First off, make sure to cap the game's frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate. Next, enable VSync, and finally set shadow quality to low. Shadow quality seems to really tank performance in the more built up areas. Although making these changes helped reduce the stuttering in my system, your mileage may vary. If things are still unplayable for you, it's time to dive into the INI files to make a few tweaks. I will leave a link in the description to an article on what changes are possible and where you can find the folders required for your respective installation. Kingdom Come Deliverance has seen significant performance updates since launch and runs pretty smoothly on this system, with an average of 72fps at the high preset. There are still a few FPS dips in towns and villages with a 1% low of 36fps. But for the most part, slinging manure at your neighbour's house is a smooth enough experience. The sign of a great night out if you ask me. A game I was not expecting to love as much as I did was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. The single player experience without EA's usual microtransactions is a breath of fresh air for Star Wars fans, and it runs well for the most part using the high preset. Yet another game built in Unreal Engine 4, it also suffers from stuttering and FPS drops throughout. With an average of 76fps, on the surface things seem fine, but with a 1% low of 44, frame rates fluctuated a bit too much for my liking. And although the game would occasionally freeze up for a few seconds, I still played through the entire game and enjoyed every minute. There seems to be a reoccurring theme with many Unreal Engine 4 games, and from what I've been able to research, the stuttering appears to be caused by the way the engine handles level loading and texture streaming. With all that said, the technical issues didn't detract too much from the gameplay experience. Next, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Whether Lara is raiding ancient tombs or beating up bad guys, the game's visuals are impressive throughout. Using a mix of ultra and high settings at 1080p, we get 67fps on average with a good 1% low of 55fps. Playing through the first few levels of the game, everything ran smooth, with no noticeable FPS dips or stuttering to be seen. Just like its predecessor, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is notoriously taxing to run, maxing out both our CPU and GPU. Running at a mixture of high and medium settings, we were able to achieve 57fps on average. I know it's not quite our 60fps target, but it's close enough. Performance took a noticeable hit during cutscenes with a 1% low of 37fps, however Assassin's Creed Odyssey is very playable at these settings. If you really want to hit that 60fps target, you could drop a few settings from high to medium at the cost of visuals. Moving on to Rage 2, with a mixture of ultra and high settings we get 62 FPS on average with respectable 1% lows. Rage 2 runs pretty well on this hardware, however I did notice very occasional stutters, but nothing that detracts too much from the experience. Overall, a really good result. Sunset Overdrive is a game that until recently I had no idea was on PC. Originally released on the Xbox One, Sunset Overdrive is a fast-paced action-adventure from Insomniac Games. With 102 FPS on average and a 1% low of 63 FPS, Sunset Overdrive runs smoothly most of the time, with some occasional stutters when there are a lot of enemies on screen. You are unable to tweak the settings much, with basic tweaks to resolution, frame rate and anti-aliasing to name a few. One setting that needs to be disabled is depth of field. This is due to a weird graphical bug that outlines in-game objects in a green glow. I honestly thought my GPU was on its last legs when I first booted up the game, but despite this initial scare, the game still looks stunning and is a noticeable improvement over the Xbox One version. Next we have Metro Exodus set to the Ultra preset with Hairworks and Tessellation disabled. These features tank performance on most systems, so it's best to disable them. On average we get 83 FPS with a 1% low of 50, not bad. Performance was stable throughout the first few levels of the game with no noticeable stutters or FPS dips. I was surprised at how well it ran, as I had heard how graphically intensive this game could be. Maybe my old system has some life left in it yet. Battlefield 5 is a game that is pretty well optimised across a range of hardware, and our system is no exception. And despite my terrible performance, Battlefield 5 performed well at the Ultra preset, with an average of 72 frames per second. The 1% low performance was good too, with 49 FPS, making for a smooth competitive experience. Playing through a few story missions also returned around the same performance, so even if you never touch the multiplayer you can expect similar results. I ran the game in DX11 mode as DX12 seems to massively tank frame rates. I'm not sure if this will be fixed in a future driver update, but for now I'd recommend sticking with DX11. Next up we have The Division 2. Running on DX12 at the high preset, we saw a return of 79 FPS on average with a 1% low of 52. The game is graphically impressive with tons of options to tweak in the menus. One such option allows gamers to toggle on and off certain effects that may cause motion sickness. It's a nice accessibility option that I wish more developers would include in their games. As someone who has experienced motion sickness with certain games myself, it's a welcome feature for sure. CSGO is a game that runs on just about anything with decent frame rates, especially when using more competitive graphical settings. However, I thought I would include it for those of you curious just how many frames are achievable at max settings. We got 185 FPS on average, great for those of you with high refresh rate monitors. And the 1% low of 85 FPS will ensure over 60 frames at all times. And those running a 60Hz monitor will still benefit from the extra frames. With frame times as low as 2.9 milliseconds, the GPU is sending more up-to-date information to the screen, making your inputs feel more responsive. Apex Legends is another esports title that seems to run well on a variety of hardware. And as with most battle royale games, it's rare for me to last longer than a few minutes. That's what she said. Over the course of 3 matches, with all settings maxed out, we saw a return of 80 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 54. I didn't notice any stutters or FPS drops, and gameplay felt smooth throughout. Skyrim Special Edition has some nice graphical improvements over the original, and seems to run more stable than the vanilla game too. However, bugs and glitches are still present, so be sure to save often. Just like the original, Skyrim Special Edition is capped to 60 FPS. Unlocking the frame rate plays havoc with the physics engine, so it's best to keep it locked for the best experience. Playing through the first hour of the game, at max settings we got 60 FPS on average with a 1% low of 59, giving us a pretty much locked 60 FPS throughout. Occasional stutters were present when loading from one area to another, but nothing too jarring. You're more likely to take an arrow in the knee than you are to experience frame rate issues. Rainbow Six Siege is another game I enjoyed despite my lack of skill. Blasting your way through enemy barricades is almost as fun as swatting an unsuspecting Twitch streamer. Using the Ultra preset, our system returned 136 FPS on average with a 1% low of 109, way over our 60 FPS target. Dropping a few settings to high will allow those of you with 144Hz monitors enjoy buttery smooth gameplay at 1080p. Remnant from the Ashes is a third-person, procedurally generated looter shooter with some Souls-like elements. No one playthrough is alike, and you may have a completely different experience when entering a friend's world. At max settings we achieve 65 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 44. For the most part gameplay feels smooth, with some occasional stutters when loading into a new area. But overall Remnant from the Ashes performs quite well. A Plague Tale: Innocence is a visually stunning, story-driven stealth adventure. The game world has a truly macabre beauty to it. Before I knew it, I'd been playing for a few hours when I realised I was supposed to be benchmarking its performance. Talking of performance, at max settings we get 76 FPS on average with a respectable 1% low of 54 FPS. This made for a stutter-free gaming experience with no noticeable performance dips. And finally, can it run Crysis? Crysis 3 to be exact. Well, setting the game to the high preset with TXAA on high, we get 74 FPS on average with a 1% low of 45. I did notice some occasional FPS dips throughout my hour-long run, but nothing that made the game unplayable. To ensure a smooth 60 FPS throughout, you could drop a few settings such as anti-aliasing and enable VSync for a more consistent experience. Okay, to wrap up, the GTX 980 and i7 4790K are still a very capable pairing when it comes to gaming at 1080p, with 60 FPS achievable at high or even max settings in most popular titles. The GTX 980's 4GB of VRAM is a limiting factor with some of the more graphically intensive games such as Red Dead Redemption 2. But for the most part, I think you'll be happy with the results when viewing on a 1080p screen. So, would I recommend you go out and build a system like this in 2020? No, probably not. I would say the i7 4790K still has a few years left in it when it comes to gaming and multi-threaded workloads, but the i7 is still selling for around £150 on the used market. You're better off with something like the Ryzen 5 3600. This is not only a newer, faster chip for around the same price, but it also leaves room to upgrade later on down the road. So what about the GTX 980? Well, unless you can find one for way under the usual used price of around £130 or $150, then I would recommend something more modern and power efficient. If you want to stick with Nvidia, on the used market it's worth looking at the 6GB variant of the GTX 1060. With used prices just a little over that of the 980 with better performance, more VRAM and less power consumption. Alternatively, you can purchase a brand new 1650 Super for about the same price as a 1060 with better performance again. On the AMD side, you can pick up a new 5500 XT, the 4GB variant, for around £160 or $180, once again with better performance and lower power consumption than the 980. Well, that's it for my final look at my aging system. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a like if you did. It took weeks of work to put this together, so your support is always appreciated. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.